Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. Get ready for a really interesting deep dive today. But first, what have you been up to? Anything exciting going on?
Oh, you know me, just thinking about life, the universe, and everything. And of course, lost in a good book as always.
You and those deep thoughts, always keeping it philosophical. Well, since we're talking about mind-blowing stuff, remember our chat about dopamine a while back?
Yeah, I think it was episode 59.4, right?
That's the one. We were just skimming the surface back then, but today we're going deep, really deep, with Dopamine Nation. Get ready to explore your brain's reward system like never before.
Yes. Dopamine Nation by Anna Lembke. It's a fascinating look at how our world today is practically designed to keep us hooked on dopamine. And you know what? It might not be making us as happy as we think.
So the book is basically saying that all the things we love, social media, that extra slice of pizza, maybe even killing it at work, are pumping us full of dopamine. And that's a bad thing. I mean, dopamine feels good, doesn't it? Isn't that the whole point?
You're right. Dopamine isn't bad in itself. It's actually really important for motivation and pleasure. The problem is we're constantly bombarded with things that trigger these huge releases of dopamine, and our brains kind of get used to it. We end up needing more and more stimulation just to feel normal. It's like developing a tolerance, but for pleasure.
Wait a minute. Are you saying I'm building up a tolerance to happiness? Like I need a bigger and bigger hit of good feelings just to stay even? That's kind of depressing, isn't it?
Think of it this way. Have you ever noticed how after you eat something super sweet, even a piece of fruit tastes kind of bland?
Oh, yeah. That happens to me all the time. I've got a bit of a sweet tooth, I'll admit. But what does that have to do with dopamine?
That's the contrast effect in action. Your brain gets used to that intense sweetness, so normal levels of sweetness don't register the same way anymore. It's the same with dopamine. If we're always chasing those big hits, the everyday joys of life start to feel less, well, joyful.
I see where you're going with this. So the book is called Dopamine Nation because it's basically saying we're all living in this dopamine-saturated world where we're constantly chasing that next high.
Exactly. And this constant chase can actually make us less happy in the long run because we become less sensitive to those simple pleasures that used to bring us joy. Always looking for the next big thing, the next dopamine rush, and we miss out on appreciating the little things.
So it's like we're on a hedonistic treadmill running faster and faster, but never really getting anywhere. We get our dopamine fix, but it's not actually making us happy.
That's a great way to put it. And this whole idea ties into what Lembke calls the pleasure-pain seesaw.
The pleasure-pain seesaw. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this seesaw.
Well, imagine a seesaw. On one side, you've got pleasure, all the dopamine-fueled good feelings. And on the other side, you have pain, discomfort, or even just a lack of that intense pleasure. The thing is, this seesaw is always trying to balance itself out.
So you're saying that for every high, there's a low lurking around the corner.
Yeah.
Like what goes up must come down.
You could say that, yeah. Our brains are wired to seek balance, even when it comes to pleasure and pain. So after a big surge of pleasure, our brains try to bring things back to a level playing field. And sometimes that means increasing our sensitivity to pain or even creating feelings of discomfort.
Hold on, you're telling me my brain is actually working against me, trying to sabotage my good mood. That doesn't seem fair. I thought dopamine was supposed to be the happy chemical.
It's more like a protective mechanism. It stops you from getting too high and then crashing too low. A natural buffer system, if you will.
Okay, I could see how that could be helpful in some situations. But what about those times when you're genuinely happy and content? Does your brain try to ruin it even then?
Even then, there's a natural pull to return to a baseline, like a rubber band snapping back after being stretched. But don't worry, it doesn't mean we can't experience happiness. It just means we need to be aware of this balancing act and find ways to manage it.
This is giving me a lot to think about. So we've got this pleasure-pain seesaw, constantly trying to find its balance point. But how does this actually play out in our lives? Can you give me a real-world example?
Sure. Think about going on a shopping spree. You buy all these amazing things, you feel great, the dopamine is flowing. But then, a few days later, the credit card bill arrives, and boom, you're hit with buyer's remorse. That's the pain side of the seesaw kicking in.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. That's why I try not to look at my bank statements after a good shopping trip. But I guess that's just my brain trying to keep things in check.
Exactly. And it's not just about shopping either. It can apply to all sorts of things. Relationships, work, even just everyday experiences. Our brains are always trying to adjust our emotional state, find that balance between pleasure and pain.
I'm starting to see how this all connects. So it's not just about chasing dopamine. It's about understanding this complex dance between pleasure and pain and how our brains are wired to handle it.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that this balancing act isn't just happening on a physical level, it's also influenced by our psychology and even by different philosophical perspectives on pain and pleasure.
Ooh, now this is where things get really interesting. You know I love a good philosophical debate. So tell me, how do different philosophies view this whole pleasure-pain dynamic? Because I have a feeling they're not all going to agree on this.
You're absolutely right about that. Different philosophical traditions have very different takes on the nature of pleasure, pain, and what it means to live a good life.
All right, let's hear it. Give me those philosophies. I'm ready to have my mind blown wide open.
Okay, let's start with Buddhism. In Buddhism, suffering is seen as a natural part of the human experience. The path to enlightenment is about freeing ourselves from this constant cycle of craving and aversion. It's not about getting rid of pleasure, but about understanding the nature of suffering and its role in our lives.
That's pretty deep stuff. It makes me think about how obsessed our culture is with chasing happiness and avoiding pain at all costs. But Buddhism is saying that maybe we need to look at it differently.
Exactly. Buddhism challenges us to consider that maybe, just maybe, suffering isn't something to be avoided at all costs, but something to be understood, even embraced as part of what it means to be human.
Okay, I see the value in that perspective. But what about other philosophies? I doubt they all agree with Buddhism on this, right?
Oh, definitely not. Take Stoicism, for example. The Stoics had a completely different take on pain and suffering. They believed that while we can't control what happens to us, we can control how we react to it.
So it's all about mindset.
Yeah.
Like if you get stuck in traffic, you can either stress out about it or you can see it as a chance to practice patience.
Exactly. The Stoics believed that by focusing on what we can control, our thoughts, emotions, and actions, we can find peace and fulfillment even when things are tough.
I like this Stoic approach. It's practical and empowering. But what about other philosophies? I'm curious to hear more about how they see this whole pleasure-pain equation.
Well, another interesting perspective comes from existentialism. Existentialists really emphasize the freedom and responsibility each person has to create meaning in a world that often feels meaningless. They might argue that even in this dopamine nation, where pleasure is everywhere, we still have the choice to define what truly matters to us and go after those things, even if it takes effort and sacrifice.
So even if we could eliminate all pain and suffering, we'd still have to deal with the big questions of existence, questions of meaning, purpose, and how to live a life that's authentic and true to ourselves.
Exactly. And those questions can't be answered by just chasing dopamine hits. They require introspection, reflection, and a willingness to engage with the complexities of life, the good and the bad.
This is really making me think. So we've got Buddhism saying suffering is part of life, Stoicism saying we can choose how we react to it, and existentialism saying we still have the freedom to create meaning even in a world of easy pleasure. That's quite a range of viewpoints.
It is, and it just goes to show that this whole pleasure-pain thing is so much more complex than just chasing dopamine. It's about our psychology, our culture, our philosophy, and ultimately our choices.
This has been a mind-opening conversation already. I'm rethinking my relationship with dopamine and all those things I thought were making me happy.
Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a moment to think about this dopamine-fueled world we live in. Ready to dig into how this pleasure-pain seesaw thing actually works in our lives?
Let's do it. We've laid the groundwork. Now let's get practical. Give me some real-world examples of how this dopamine overload is messing with us.
Well, one thing Lemke really emphasizes in Dopamine Nation is that our world today is like a giant buffet of dopamine. We're literally surrounded by things designed to trigger those pleasure centers in our brains. Social media, video games, junk food, online shopping. It's like we're constantly being tempted with instant gratification everywhere we turn.
Oh, I totally feel that. Every notification, every swipe, every click, they're all little dopamine hits. And let's be honest, I'm not always so good at resisting those temptations, especially social media. That endless scroll can suck me in for hours.
And that's the problem. Those little hits might feel good right now, but over time they lead to this dopamine overload situation. Our brains get so used to all that stimulation that they actually become less sensitive to pleasure.
It's like we're building up a tolerance, just like we talked about earlier with the sugar example.
Exactly. It's like we're chasing this high that keeps getting further and further away. And the really scary part is that this dopamine overload can actually lead to some serious problems, like addiction.
Okay, hold on a minute. Are you saying that all those things we love, social media, video games, even that extra scoop of ice cream could actually be addictive.
Well, it's not quite as simple as that. Addiction is really complex, right? But Lemke's point is that a lot of the things people struggle with these days, things like social media addiction, binge watching, overeating, even compulsive shopping, can be seen as forms of dopamine dependence. We're constantly searching for those quick bursts of pleasure, even if they end up having negative consequences in our lives.
I get it. It's like we're trading long-term well-being for these quick dopamine hits. So if we're living in this dopamine nation where everything is designed to trigger our pleasure centers, what can we do about it? How do we escape this dopamine dependence cycle?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But thankfully, Lemke does offer some solutions in her book. One of her main recommendations is something she calls dopamine fasting.
Dopamine fasting. Okay, that sounds intense. Does that mean giving up everything that makes me happy? Like no more coffee, no chocolate, no more funny cat videos? That sounds like torture.
Haha. It's not that extreme. It's more about consciously choosing to avoid certain activities for a period of time. The goal is to reset your dopamine receptors and make yourself more sensitive to pleasure again.
So like a digital detox, where you disconnect from social media for a while. Or maybe giving up sugar for a week.
You got it. It's all about giving your brain a break, a chance to recalibrate and step away from that constant dopamine bombardment. And it doesn't have to be forever. Even a few hours a day a week, or a weekend without your phone can make a difference. The point is to give your brain some time to reset.
Okay, that sounds a little more doable. But if I'm being honest, I'm a little skeptical. Can just a bit of dopamine fasting really change anything?
Well, think about it this way. Have you ever noticed how much more you appreciate something once you've gone without it for a while? Like that first cup of coffee after giving it up for a few days, or how much better a meal tastes when you haven't been snacking all day?
Yeah, that's true. When I finally give in to something I've been craving, it definitely feels more satisfying.
So are you saying that dopamine fasting can help us appreciate the things we enjoy more?
Exactly. It's about retraining our brains to find pleasure in those simpler, everyday joys, the things we might be taking for granted. And it's not just about deprivation, it's about being intentional with our dopamine.
Intentional dopamine. So you've got my attention. What exactly is this intentional dopamine business?
It's all about paying attention to the activities that genuinely bring you joy and fulfillment, and then making a conscious effort to do those things more often. The goal is to create a life full of meaningful experiences rather than just chasing those fleeting dopamine hits.
So prioritizing quality over quantity when it comes to our dopamine. Like maybe instead of spending hours scrolling through social media, I spend that time hanging out with friends in person, working on a hobby, or learning something new. Making choices that line up with your values and goals instead of just getting pulled along by whatever gives you the next dopamine hit. And that brings us to another important strategy, delaying gratification.
Delaying gratification. Isn't that the marshmallow test thing where they give kids a marshmallow and tell them if they wait, they'll get two later?
That's the one. And studies have shown that the kids who could wait actually did better later in life. Better grades, social skills, even better health.
Wow, really? So it's not just about resisting those instant dopamine hits. It's about learning to be more patient and value the rewards that come from waiting.
Exactly. It's about shifting our focus from I want it now to appreciating those long-term rewards. It's not always easy, especially in our fast-paced, on-demand world, but it's a skill you can learn with practice.
I'm starting to get the bigger picture here. It's not just about giving things up. It's about cultivating this mindset of patience, being intentional, and appreciating what we have. But I got to say, I'm a little worried about technology's role in all this. It feels like technology has made this dopamine overload problem way worse, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Technology has definitely played a huge part in shaping this dopamine nation we're living in. Just think about how social media platforms are designed. They're all about keeping us scrolling, liking, and sharing, constantly feeding us those little dopamine hits with every notification, like, and comment.
It's this never-ending cycle of looking for validation and wanting everything right now, and I'll admit, I've fallen into that trap myself. I can waste hours on social media comparing myself to other people and feeling bad if I don't get enough likes or comments.
And that's the real risk of these platforms. They're designed to tap into our dopamine system and keep us coming back for more. It's not just social media either. Think about video games, streaming services, even online shopping. They're all designed to keep us hooked, keep us coming back, keep those dopamine levels high.
It's like we're constantly bombarded with stimulation and there's no escape. Even when I'm trying to relax and watch a movie, I still find myself reaching for my phone to check notifications or scroll through social media.
It's definitely a challenge. But here's the thing, technology is a double-edged sword. It contributes to the problem, but it can also be part of the solution.
Really? Tell me more about how technology can help.
Well, think about all those apps and programs designed to help people manage their screen time, track their habits, and even practice mindfulness.
That's true. I've actually started using an app that limits my time on certain apps, and it has been really helpful. I'm spending less time mindlessly scrolling and more time on things I actually enjoy.
I'm glad to hear it. There are also a ton of online communities and resources that offer support and advice for people struggling with addiction or other challenges related to dopamine. So while technology can be part of the problem, it can also be part of the solution. It really depends on how we choose to use it and whether we're using it mindfully and intentionally.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's all about taking back control and using technology as a tool for our own well-being, not letting it control us.
Exactly. It's about becoming more aware of how we interact with technology and making sure it aligns with our values and goals.
This conversation has been so eye-opening. I'm already thinking about ways to apply all this to my own life. Before we go too far, can we recap some of the key points we've covered about Dopamine Nation and this whole dopamine thing?
Good idea. It's always helpful to take a moment and think about what we've learned.
Okay, so we talk about how modern society is like this giant dopamine buffet, constantly tempting us with easy pleasure, which can lead to dopamine overload and make us less sensitive to those good feelings. We also explored dopamine fasting and delaying gratification as ways to reset our brains and appreciate those simpler pleasures again.
Right, and we talked about how technology is both part of the problem and part of the solution. It all comes down to how we choose to use it consciously and intentionally.
You got it. And we talked about how addiction can show up in all sorts of ways, not just with drugs and alcohol, but also with things like too much social media, video games, even shopping.
Recognizing that addiction can take many forms is important, and understanding how dopamine plays a role can be helpful in addressing it.
Absolutely. And last but not least, we talked about how understanding the dopamine system and how it affects our behavior can be empowering for everyone, not just people struggling with addiction. It's all about making conscious choices that lead to well-being and happiness.
That's a great summary. We've covered a lot today. There's one more piece of this puzzle we need to look at, though, the philosophical and ethical side of all this.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. It's not just about the science of dopamine. It's about what all of this means for us as human beings.
Exactly. So, are you ready to jump into the philosophical depths of this dopamine dilemma?
Bring it on. I'm ready to dive deep. All right, let's get philosophical. I love these big picture questions. We've been talking about Dopamine Nation, dopamine overload, and how it's affecting us. But now I want to zoom out for a minute. What does all of this mean for us as human beings?
That's a great question, and it's one Lemke tackles in her book, too. One of the big things she asks is, what does it even mean to live a good life in a world that's basically designed to get us hooked on dopamine? Are we giving up something important, something essential for these quick hits of pleasure?
It makes you wonder, are we missing out on something deeper, something with more meaning, because we're so focused on chasing these dopamine rushes? Like, what's the point of all this pleasure if it doesn't lead to real happiness?
Exactly. It challenges our whole idea of what happiness really is and the role that things like pain and discomfort actually play in a fulfilling life. Like, would we really be happier if we could eliminate all pain and suffering? Or would we be missing a crucial part of what it means to be human?
Whoa, that's a big question. It reminds me of that classic philosophical debate. Is happiness the ultimate goal of life? Or is there something more to it than just feeling good all the time?
It's a classic for a reason, and this dopamine conversation really brings it to the forefront. Think about it. If we could actually manipulate our brain chemistry to feel pleasure whenever we wanted, what would happen to our free will? Are we really making choices that matter to us, or are we just following our dopamine cravings?
That's a mind-blowing thought. It sounds like science fiction, but with all the advancements in technology, it doesn't feel so far-fetched anymore. Imagine a world where we could take a pill or get a brain implant to feel happy whenever we wanted. Would that really be a good thing? Would it even be real happiness?
That's worth thinking about. Would we still value joy and happiness if it were so easy to get? Would we still strive for meaning and purpose if we could skip over all the hard parts, the struggles that often lead us to those things?
I don't know. When I think about the times I've felt the most fulfilled and happy, it's often been after overcoming some kind of challenge or working hard toward a goal. Those moments of joy felt earned, like they meant something because I had to put in the effort, sometimes even go through some pain to get there.
That's so true. It seems like pain and discomfort, even though they don't feel good, are actually really important for growth, learning, and experiencing the full range of human emotions. Without the lows, the highs wouldn't feel as high, would they?
I'm starting to see that. It's like those different philosophical perspectives we talked about earlier. Buddhism says that suffering is part of life. Stoicism says we can choose how we respond to the hard times. And existentialism says we always have the freedom to create meaning, even in a world that sometimes feels meaningless. They all seem to agree that pain and discomfort aren't things to avoid at all costs, but maybe they're actually opportunities to grow and learn.
That's a great connection. It all comes back to that fundamental question. What makes a good life? Maybe it's not about chasing pleasure all the time and trying to avoid pain, but about finding a balance, accepting all that comes with being human, good and bad, and using those experiences to grow and learn.
That makes so much sense. It's about embracing the whole messy, beautiful, challenging experience of being human, dopamine and all.
I love that. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from Dopamine Nation and everything we've talked about today is that we really need to be aware of how dopamine affects us. We need to pay attention to how our world is set up to keep us hooked on those dopamine hits, and we need to make choices that will help us in the long run, even if that means resisting the urge for instant gratification.
So it's not about trying to get rid of dopamine or pretending it's this evil thing. It's about understanding it, managing it, and learning to use it to our advantage.
That's it. It's about finding that sweet spot, that balance point, where we can enjoy the good stuff in life without becoming controlled by it, where we can face the tough times and learn from them. It's about living a life that's full of meaning and fulfillment.
This has been such an amazing conversation. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how dopamine works, how it affects my behavior, and how I can actually use that knowledge to live a happier, more fulfilling life.
That's fantastic. I hope our listeners are feeling the same way.
I bet they are. This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive into Dopamine Nation and the whole idea of dopamine in general. So, to all our amazing listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey. Keep those brains active, keep those dopamine levels in check, and keep those conversations going. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, keep seeking out those meaningful moments, those genuine connections, and those experiences that make life truly worth living. I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.